and he was a columnist and one of the co-founders of Maximum Rock and Roll fanzine, which was a very popular international fanzine / magazine type thing that happened for many, many decades. Jeff BALE, how are you, man?
How you doing, buddy? Thanks for inviting me on the show, and so we can shoot the bull for a while. Appreciate it.
Yeah, great having you here, man. And, you know, it was funny. I first met you back in 1983 at Tuts in Chicago, a punk club there, when I was in my very first band, Unaccepted, and we opened for a band called the Necros.
Mm-hmm. Sure. The Necros from Michigan, from Detroit, or actually Ann Arbor. I think Barry's from Ann Arbor. So where I had actually gone to undergraduate school up there at University of Michigan. So it was kind of a funny coincidence. But yeah, I remember you played that gig, and I think if I'm not mistaken, I know we were talking about this a couple of weeks ago when we met in person. But I thought you guys opened for like that Finnish band Restitute and the Italian band Raw Power at a gig that also, like, maybe it was at Tut, maybe it's some other club there, but I vaguely recall you guys playing that show as well, but maybe I'm just not remembering correctly. I don't know.
Well, you know, that does tend to happen sometimes. I remember seeing Raw Power back in the day, but I've never played with them to my recollection.
Okay, then maybe I'm the one that's mistaken. You know, when you've seen over 6,200 live rock and roll shows in your life, like I have, sometimes the details get blurred together. So.
Well, that's why you're here. You're one of the guys that's been so absorbed in this from the beginning. Like, how did you first get into rock and roll, Jeff?
Well, you know, I had kind of a shitty childhood. My father left my mom, and then I grew up with my mom, and then she kind of became an alcoholic and ended up on welfare. And so I was looking for ways to escape, and the ways that I found was spending a lot of time reading at the local library and then listening to rock and roll. So, you know, I was listening to, rock and roll even before the British invasion, but then the British invasion stuff began, and the Beatles and the Stones and all that stuff. But really what really blew me away was when the first time I was lying on my bed and I heard the Kinks' You Really Got Me. I guess that must have been 1964, 65, and I just was like so blown away by that song that I've been like a rock and roll fanatic ever since. And so I really was started out primarily into the hard-edged British invasion bands like the Who and the Kinks and the Yardbirds and the Pretty Things and all that kind of stuff. And then I really got into the 60s garage stuff. And of course, Chicago, I grew up in Chicago, so Chicago is one of the epicenters of 60s garage, which now called 60s garage punk. And there were tons of great bands, like the Shadows of Night being only one of the more famous, but there were many other great bands, that the Dirty Words and so forth and so on. So I started going out. You know, I was in my mid-teens at the time, and we would go out to these little youth clubs and stuff, and see local bands, local garage bands. At these teen events, I guess you'd say, and so that was really when I began my lifelong pattern of attending live gigs, and then we moved into the kind of early psychedelic periods. So there's the psychedelic garage transitional phase, and then early psych when it was still pretty rockin', and then in the later period, the psychedelic stuff began to get more noodly and doodly and lame, and then that turned into kind of the proto metal stuff like Led Zeppelin, and which I never really liked. I never liked Led Zeppelin and Hendrix and things like that. And then we had that kind of bad, what I would consider a very bad period. I mean, I liked the psychedelic stuff from San Francisco back then, but then there was that kind of really bad period in the late 60s and early 70s, kind of bluesy based power trios and hard rock bands and proto metal bands, but I didn't like that stuff much. But then fortunately the glam came around, and I liked the better glam bands. Of course, Alice Cooper, they were going along a lot earlier than that. I saw them many times, and the Stooges and so forth. The proto punk stuff began, and so then it was you know, it was all that the '70s, the early '70s was mainly kind of like a barren wasteland, I would say, as far as in the history of rock and roll. But then, thankfully, punk starts in '76 and '77, and then immediately I had sort of been waiting for it all my life, I felt. So I jumped right on into that scene immediately, and then the rest is kind of history. You know, I've been listening to, you know, all the most primitive underground rock and roll subgenres, really going back to my mid-teens, and I'm still listening to them today. So nothing's really changed.
That is so cool, man. You have literally lived it, listened to it, and you know it. And I know you've been a teacher in more than one way as well. But, you know, I want to get into, like, how did you end up forming Maximum Rock and Roll, which became a very relevant thing in many people's lives concerning rock and roll and punk rock? How did that happen?
Well, I basically, like in 1979, in the summer of 1979, I moved from the Midwest, from Ann Arbor. I moved out to San Francisco because I was going to Berkeley to get my PhD, and so I got out there like in the mid or late summer of '79. And of course, once I got out there, of course, I had a big thriving punk scene, and so right away I started going out to gigs and, you know, getting to know people in bands and meeting other people who were mainstays of the scene, if you want to call it that. And so at a certain point, Tim Yohannan, who had already had like a radio show, the Maximum Rock and Roll radio show before I had arrived, he had found out from, I think, Jello, that I was a huge record collector. Of course, I had thousands and thousands of records, and including tons and tons of punk records already. And of course, you know, Tim was a big collector of vinyl and rock and roll and punk stuff. So when he found out that there was somebody new in town that might have records he didn't have, he wanted to meet me. So I ran into him at a gig, and then he came over to my house, and he did in fact discover that I had a bunch of really rare punk records that he didn't have. And so then he said, "Do you want to come on the show?" And so I said, "Sure." And so I started coming on the show and then playing, you know, selecting sets. And you know, I have kind of a big mouth, so you know, I wasn't like a shy wallflower on the air, kind of like you, I imagine. You know, you're good at talking and generating interest and so forth. So anyway, so then I became one of the main people doing the DJ on the MRR radio show, and then after that, you know, we were thinking about starting like a punk magazine, and so in fact we did a couple of years later. I think the first issue might have been like. It came in with an insert with the first MR compilation, the Not So Quiet on the Western Front, and then after that, you know, the magazine started coming out, you know, on a fairly regular basis because Tim was a really good organizer and so forth and so on. So, you know, he had that thing running like a machine as far as publishing on time and all that kind of thing. So that's the long and the short of it, basically, buddy.
Yeah, that was incredible. That magazine affected so many people's lives and connected so many people, even more importantly, really, across the world and the United States. I mean, a lot of us used it as a complete directory to live and not only just do gigs.
Yeah, well, that might have been a mistake. but I will say the good news, or the good thing about the magazine is that, you know, we began to get correspondence and people writing in from all over the world describing their local scenes, and then bands from all these different countries, punk bands from all over the world, started sending us copies of their records and so forth for review. And so, I mean, to me, the best thing about Maximum Rock and Roll was kind of like linking together all these underground punk scenes from all over the world, and sort of helping to create like a little bit of a circuit where bands could tour, underground bands could tour on an underground circuit from country to country and play all over the place because people had already read about them and so forth and so on. So to me, that was the best thing about Maximum Rock and Roll, sort of creating this worldwide network that enabled us to kind of like facilitate the establishment of an underground gig circuit and everything. We're touring where underground bands could tour all over the world and everything like that, and learn about each other, and people could go see them and everything. You know.
Yeah.
So the bad part, of course, was you know, the increasingly dogmatic politics, and that's really what eventually alienated me so much that I just decided I didn't want to be associated with the magazine anymore. So,
well, to me, the classified ad section was really awesome in connecting me with half of my library of music, and then of course the scene reports were invaluable. So thanks for all the years that you did put into that, because it really did change the lives of a lot of people as far as what we're talking about with these connections and establishing an underground sort of different hierarchy of music and the way of living. Man, it was cool.
Well, I'm glad I was able to make a contribution to doing that, and of course I was the editor of the record review section, so we would review hundreds of records every issue, so that gave readers exposure to all kinds of obscure records, and then they could go out and hunt them down, and if they liked them, then they could go see the bands if those bands happened to play live anywhere near them and everything like that, So yeah, for people who are like obsessive record collectors, or people who want to find get a hold of the most obscure bands and stuff like that, I think our record review section was really one of the most comprehensive. And of course, we have to give credit to Flipside and other zines, because they were doing the same thing. I don't want to make it seem like we were the only magazine doing those kinds of things. There were other ones before us, and there were others after us as well. But Flipside actually, I think, predated Maximum Rock and Roll a little bit, and they were already doing some of that stuff. So we should give credit to Al and them for where credit's due.
That's so cool of you to make sure to give credit. I forgot about Flipside, and I did read that magazine just as much as MRR, but they had a kind of a different tone to them. It seemed like Flipside was more California sort of vibe, whereas MRR was more international, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, they were really rooted in the local community, and then I would say more of the coverage was local there than an MR. I mean, we had a pretty considerable amount of local coverage, mainly in the Bay Area, but we really made an effort to identify and give coverage to and get records from great bands all over the world, and so. And I think that did actually, of course, then Flipside began doing more of that as well. So I think between the two of us, and then then of course there was, magazines, Jack Rabbit does in New York, and various other people. Other people put out a lot of good magazines too, and did a lot of reviews and coverage and stuff. So it really became like there was kind of like a network of zines, and then there was a network of bands, and then there was like networks of record stores that sold underground punk records, and so it was pretty cool, because we were really able to create this entire underground scene, this entire countercultural underground scene that was separate from the music industry and everything like that. Although of course there was overlapping, because sometimes bands would become more popular enough to actually release records on major labels, and then they would become more part of the normal record business. But as long as there's always new bands coming up, and there always is, even up to the present day. I mean, the thing that I always like to say is, most people who listen to music, they get stuck in a time warp. In other words, they really identify with the music that was popular when they were young, because it reminds them of the best days of their lives, or it has that nostalgic quality. So people from the 50s will listen to 50s music and doo-wop and whatever, and people from like the early 60s will listen to the British Invasion stuff, and or other kinds of things like Motown or whatever, and then people who grew up with 60s garage and psychedelic will listen to that stuff, and then nowadays you got, of course, people who grew up with 77 punk who only listen to 77 punk and things like that. And so, but my attitude has always been, I'm always looking for great new underground rock and roll bands, as long as they're primitive and they got like hooks, and because the great thing about rock and roll is you can take the same 3 or 4 chords and just constantly mix and match them, and it always ends up sounding great,
Amen, amen. That's such a great point. We don't have a ton of time left, bro. I'm sorry, but you're so interesting to talk with. Do you have anything coming up in the future, like any books planned or any future endeavors we should know about?
Well, of course, I'm writing academic books because I've been a university professor for a while. But I do have I am going to be. I do write record reviews for Ugly Things magazine, which of course is in my opinion, the best underground rock magazine in the world. Mike Stack's. It's based down in San Diego, but it's one of the most literate and best informed magazines, underground rock and roll magazines, and most of the people who write for it are like people who are just total experts and obsessive compulsive fanatics like you and I are, in a way.
Exactly. So, good word. Yeah.
So it's pretty cool. So that's the main thing I've been doing as far as public music stuff, is just writing some record reviews when I have free time. And the big bummer, for me and for you and for every other rock and roll fan, is this COVID crap has really made it impossible to see live gigs, or much more difficult to see live gigs, and it kind of sucks because I'm getting old now. I'm like 70, and I still have a lot of energy. I still want to go out and listen to underground rock shows, and I feel like as long as there's these stupid lockdowns and so forth and so on, it just creates a situation where it's like, I only have X amount of time left in my life, and I want to use it seeing some great gigs. And I really haven't been able to see great gigs since live ones, at least since February or March of 2020. So it's kind of sucking.
Well, Greg, Jeff, it's so awesome to talk to you after all these years, and it was great to see you recently. I'm going to have to let you go, but man, I hope to talk to you again down the road. I do wish you the best, and we're going to do some necros in your honor from 1983.
All right, sounds good. I appreciate it. Okay, thanks a lot for the opportunity, buddy. Talk to you soon.
Of course, enjoy your dinner tonight. I know your partner's making some chow, so enjoy and take care, my friend.
Okay, will do. Take care.
Yeah, rock on, man.